All right, let's get right into it. We're going to break down realism, which is one of the oldest, most influential, and honestly, most pessimistic ideas in all of world politics. It's a theory that really tries to explain why countries act the way they do. I mean, it's a huge question, right? You see it in the news every single day. Conflicts, military budgets, all of it. Well, for literally centuries, this theory, realism, has offered a really powerful and, yeah, kind of grim answer to that question. So, to really get this theory, you have to understand its whole vibe. People often call it the no-nonsense approach. It's all about looking at how the world really works, by stripping away all the talk about ideals and focusing on the cold, hard logic of power. Okay, so here's the most important point. Realism sees the world not as some big, happy community, but more like a really tough neighborhood. There's no world police, you know? No global 911 you can call for help. And in that kind of environment, every single country is pretty much just looking out for number one. And these assumptions, they create this really strong chain of logic. I mean, think about it. If you accept that there's no world government, then it totally follows that countries have to be self-interested just to survive. And if everyone is looking out for themselves, well, then the world becomes this constant struggle for power, where the only real peace comes from making sure nobody gets too powerful. Let's go back in time for a minute. We're going to trace this idea all the way back to its roots, which go back way back to ancient times. This is where we find the original argument for why the world is such a competitive place. Wow. This line from the ancient Greek historian Thucydides just gets right to the heart of what we call classical realism. The argument here is that this endless fight for power in the world, it doesn't come from some complicated system. Nope, it starts with us. It's just human nature. So fast forward a couple of thousand years, and you get thinkers like Hans Morgenthau, who was a giant of 20th century realism. He basically took that ancient idea and built a whole framework around it. For him, politics is driven by these objective laws that are a direct reflection of our own flawed, self-interested, and power-seeking human nature. And this really is the core of the classical view. See, it's a bottom-up theory. If you want to understand why nations are always clashing, you don't start by looking at governments or economics. You start with a person. You start with that unchanging, universal human desire to get ahead, to have some control, to dominate. But what if human nature wasn't the whole story? Later in the 20th century, a challenger appeared. A whole new way of thinking emerged that looked at the exact same world, but came to a completely different conclusion about what causes all the conflict. This guy, Kenneth Waltz, he basically flipped classical realism right on its head. He argued that the problem isn't that leaders or people are necessarily greedy for power. The real problem is the dangerous system that they all have to live and operate in. And this concept of anarchy is the absolute cornerstone of Waltz's theory, which we call neorealism or structural realism. It's super important to remember, anarchy here doesn't mean chaos and riots in the streets. It just means there's no higher power, no world government that can stop one country from attacking another. The Cold War is a perfect example of this. According to Waltz, that conflict wasn't really about good versus evil. It was about two massive powers trapped in an anarchic system. They were forced into a huge arms race simply to guarantee their own survival. The system itself, the structure, made them compete no matter who was in charge in Washington or Moscow. So this sets up a really fascinating intellectual showdown. You've got two different versions of realism. They both agree that the world is a struggle for power, but they fundamentally disagree on why. And their differences really boil down to two key questions. So let's put these two theories head to head, right? Because they give you totally different answers to these two questions. Why do you even want power in the first place? And how much power is ever really enough? And here it is, the core difference in a nutshell. Look at that first question, why power? Morgenthau says the drive comes from inside us. It's that human will to power. But Waltz says, no, it's an external pressure. The system forces you to seek power, not out of greed, but out of fear. You need it to survive. And then for the second question, how much is enough? The classical realist says going for total domination is usually a dumb idea. But the neorealist says it's less about domination and more about just maintaining your spot in the global balance of power, because that's what keeps you safe. So, okay, why does this old academic debate still matter so much today? Well, because even though realism has had a huge impact on how countries act, it also has some pretty big blind spots, especially when you look at the world we're living in right now. Critics will point out that realism, because it's so focused on states and power, has a really hard time explaining stuff like the European Union, or the massive influence of a global tech company, or even why countries would cooperate to fight a pandemic when, according to the theory, they should just be competing. And that is the huge question facing us today, isn't it? Realism gives us this incredibly powerful tool for understanding conflict and competition. But as our world gets more and more interconnected, with all these new players and new threats that don't care about borders, you have to wonder if this old no-nonsense theory can still tell us the whole story.